Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's EurAgri webinar on the theme of reflections on COP26. My name is Jerry Boyle, and I'm president of EurAgri. And for those of you that maybe don't know about EurAgri, we're a network of European public research and innovations organizations that focus on the themes of agriculture, food research and innovation, and land use. And of course, we do welcome new members all of the time. So please check out our website if you're interested in joining the network. I'm also your moderator for this morning's panel discussion. And I will be joined by our fellow board member, Sylvia Burrens from the University of Ghent, who will be monitoring the Q&A online. And again, we want to encourage everyone to submit questions. And so I'm hoping we'll have lots of them, as I'm sure we will. I had the privilege of attending COP26 for almost the 2 weeks of the entire event. And naturally, I focused on those sessions that were dealing with agriculture and food, land use, and so on. And these themes would be of particular interest to EurAgri members. But of course, I'm sure all of our interests extended way beyond just agriculture, given the huge importance of this particular COP as we approach the significant threshold, and indeed possibly exceed the significant threshold of 1.5 degree Celsius, which was of course emphasized as the critical threshold at the Paris COP. And the sessions that we're going to focus on today, or the themes we're going to focus on today, and with our three speakers, are very much a personal selection of mine. Hopefully they will generate a fair bit of discussion. One of the first areas that we're going to focus on this morning is the broad area of nature-based solutions. And one of the points of discussion that I thought was particularly interesting at COP was the emphasis through many of the sessions that while agriculture certainly contributes to global warming, and we all know how it does through emissions, it also is part of the solution. And that's a positive message that I think many European and world farmers across the world do welcome. And a second theme, I think, which is under-discussed within the agricultural sector in Europe, certainly in my view, is the potential of carbon trading. Because all of the solutions to global warming that arise within the land use sector will require significant investment by farmers and by government. And one of the opportunities I think that needs to be explored and discussed is the whole role of carbon trading. That was another theme that came up at a number of the sessions. And of course, finally, and I come from Ireland, as you probably have guessed, livestock production is a huge issue in respect of climate change globally, from both a food security point of view, particularly in developing countries, but also, of course, as a source of methane production. And you will be aware of the very important statement on methane that was issued by the world leaders at the beginning of COP26. So they're three themes, as I say, very much personal themes, personal issues that were of interest to me, but I think hopefully they will resonate with you as well in your own areas of work. So we have three really excellent speakers that participated in one form or another at COP. COP was a hybrid between face-to-face and online sessions. So I do remember, I think it was one of our speakers this morning, Hannah Maria, she was involved in a contribution from a studio. I was actually outside the studio watching on my online, so it was a rather strange experience. But these were some of the sessions that I thought were particularly interesting. So we have three speakers: Professor Davy McCracken from the Scottish Rural College, and of course it's so important, given that COP was in Scotland, that we have a speaker from Scotland. And Davy specialises in, among other things, in peatlands research, which of course is a critical area as far as nature-based solutions are concerned. I've previously mentioned Hannah Maria Ahonen, who is a senior consultant with the Perspectives Climate Group, and gave a really interesting presentation on international carbon trading. And our final speaker is Professor Simon Oosting from Wageningen University. And of course, he's an expert on sustainable livestock systems. And I certainly think this was one of several really stimulating presentations that I had the privilege of attending anyway. And obviously from a Euragri perspective, our interest is in understanding how Europe's agriculture and innovation organizations need to adapt its innovation activity and research activity to address the challenges of global warming. And again, underlining the urgency of those challenges. So as far as housekeeping is concerned, each speaker will have about 15 to 20 minutes to make their presentations. And as I said at the beginning, there will be an opportunity for questions from you, the viewership, and at the end of each presentation, if there's a specific question for the speaker, that can be taken at that point. But of course, we want to leave as much time as possible for a general discussion at the end of the three presentations. So please use the Q&A, and Sylvia will feed your questions through to the speakers. So our first speaker will be Professor Davy McCracken. So it's over to you, Davy. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry, and thank you to Euragri for the opportunity to speak to you today. Can you just confirm that you can all see my screen okay?
Yes, perfect.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So, good morning, folks. I work for Scotland's Rural College. I head up a Hill and Mountain Research Centre, as well as being head of a wider Department of Integrated Land Management. So COP26, we're all aware of COP26, that it was badged as the humanity's last chance to try and get climate change down to within 1.5 degrees. As far as the outcomes from it were concerned, particularly with regard to agriculture, well, we did get a pledge from world leaders to actually halt deforestation by 2030, and clearly some, if not much of the deforestation across the globe is for land for agricultural purposes. And thanks to Bloomberg for this small screenshot about what they regarded as the wins and the losses from the COP26 process. Possibly the wins are a little overemphasized, and certainly many people feel that many of the losses, particularly that the pledges made at this particular COP, are focused only on a track for 2.4 degree rise, not 1.5 degree rise. But agriculture will likely feature much more fully at the next COP in Egypt next year. But Simon and colleagues are going to talk about the agricultural and methane aspect later on in this session. So COP26 was in Scotland. For those of you that don't know Scotland, the purple on the map there is where our mountain or mountainous character land is, and 70% of Scotland is agriculture. So agriculture is an important part of Scotland's land mass, and mountains therein are an important part of Scotland. Scotland, as you probably know, is very wet. That's the average rainfall over the last 30 years. The darker the blue, the more the rain. But actually, it's getting wetter. So the darker the blue on the second slide is where rainfall in winter 2020, i.e. last winter, was over 150% more rain than would normally be anticipated. And that's down to climate change. Hopefully you're familiar with these type of diagrams on the right hand side there. That's every year, in this example Scotland, from 1884 to 2018, and the darker the red highlights a particular year when the average temperature within that year was higher than the long-term average. The darker the blue is where it was lower than the long-term average. But you can clearly see that from the mid 1990s onwards, we're clearly within an area of climate change, a period of ongoing climate change within Scotland, as we are elsewhere in the globe. But I'm an ecologist, looking at farming and wildlife interactions, and we've actually been in a biodiversity crisis for a lot longer than we have at least recognised the climate change emergency. And from a biodiversity perspective, then what's called nature-based solutions, management of land that actually helps both biodiversity and helps mitigate climate change, is seen as a big and important opportunity to address both of these global emergencies. And certainly at COP26, the big focus on COP26, because Scotland has quite a lot of peatland, I'll come back to that later in the presentation, was on peatland and peatland issues and what's happening in Scotland and elsewhere across the world. So there was a peatland pavilion that SRUC was one of the partners that sort of designed elements of the activities through the 2 weeks of COP at that. And as Jerry's already mentioned, so myself and my team within SRUC, we look at agricultural challenges as well as environmental challenges. But if you think of the scale of change that we actually need to see in our land here in Scotland, for example, but it's true elsewhere in the globe, what we can do, and you don't need to read this particular slide or that particular bubble, that's just an example of the range of things we are doing with regard to agricultural practices in upland areas that can help make a difference in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and cost effectiveness and efficiency associated with upland livestock systems. There is lots that can be done, there is lots that is being done, but nevertheless, the point of this slide is to emphasize that even by doing that, and doing that is important from an agricultural perspective, it's only going to get us so far towards, well, in Scotland, we have an aspiration to be net zero by 2045. Elsewhere in the globe, it's 2050. And it's only by doing many of what are called these nature-based solutions, only by looking at more biodiversity management, more flood mitigation, more peatland restoration and more woodland creation, in the Scottish example, will we stand any chance of actually sequestering a greater amount of carbon and allowing our agricultural systems to stand any chance of reaching net zero as a whole by 2045, which is the Scottish target. And I've already said that Scotland's agricultural land plays a vital role in doing that. 70% of Scotland's land is agriculture. Only 8% of Scotland's agricultural land is arable or capable of being cropped on an annual basis. Another 20% of Scotland's agricultural land is good quality, low ground grassland. But the vast majority of Scotland's agricultural land, as I've mentioned earlier, in the purple on the map here, is either upland, if you think of your uplands as mountains with pointy bits on them, or because of latitude effect, the further north and west you go in Scotland, you find soils, vegetation and climate akin to mountainous situations occurring all the way down to sea level. And actually, that's important. What we do in our agricultural land is important. It's also important what we do with regard to peatlands. So the middle map here, the purple, is where peatlands are located within Scotland. 20% of Scotland is peatland, and only about 18% of Scotland is currently woodland. And I'll talk about our water systems as well later on. The important thing about putting all four of these together is what we do in our farmland will influence how well we can actually restore peatlands, how well we can manage and create new woodlands, and how well we can actually manage both water quality as well as water quantity. From a biodiversity perspective, just a few examples of what we've done at our upland research and demonstration farm in the Southern Highlands. Purely from a biodiversity perspective, there's lots that can be done in an upland farming system. Simply fencing off these water margins to reduce the amount of pollution getting into the watercourses on the farm can allow the tall vegetation to flourish. This is a good place for plants, a good place for insects, but also a good place for foraging birds, bats, etc. So we can do a lot for biodiversity in a relatively small part of our livestock of our farm systems, even in the uplands. And at Kirkton Ortotire, that's the name of the farms in the Southern Highlands, we get between 2.5 and 3.5 metres of rain per year. Up until 5 years ago, there was no standing water on the farm. We were keen to remove the water as much as possible away from the farm. But we created these wetland areas 6 years ago, primarily with a focus on trying to actually improve feeding habitat for foraging birds, but they also are a very good habitat for insects like these different dragonfly species here. So again, wetlands will help from a climate change perspective, but they can also help from a biodiversity perspective. We have a lot of peatland in Scotland. We have a lot of peatland on our farm. These are just three examples of how you can actually restore peatlands. Much peatland in Scotland is what's called peat hags. It's where, before the restoration, this was a bare bank, an exposed bank of dry peat soil, and it's been what's called reprofiled. The vegetation has been put back on top of it to cap any of the emissions. We also get a lot of drainage channels, erosion channels occurring where water is rushing off our hills. We can actually put small dams in to allow shallow amount of water to appear behind them, which also allows the sphagnum to recolonize and gradually reform peatlands. And there are some flat areas called peat pans that can be re-wetted and allow the vegetation to actually recolonize those bare areas of peat that are emitting emissions into the atmosphere. And trees are highly important, will be very important in Scotland and elsewhere going forward. We've done a lot of work on our farm, on the low ground part of our farm, in terms of integrating more trees into either the riparian zones along the riversides, or as shelter belts within the fields, or even as individual trees within each fields, to actually get more trees in from a biodiversity perspective, but also to actually sequester carbon. And also, and just as importantly, despite the fact that we get 2.5 to 3 metres of rain per year, as I said, trees will be very important for shelter, livestock shelter at this time of the year. But even where we are, the last 3 years, we've seen drought-like conditions during the summer. So we also need more trees in our livestock systems from a shade perspective for livestock. And we can put in trees at a different scale. We've put in trees at a different scale. This is over 200 hectares in the high mountain environment where we've planted what's called montane woodland. And this is just an example of one part of that woodland on the right-hand side. Integrating trees onto farms can come in different scales, sizes, and types. And so we know that we can benefit biodiversity in our farming systems. We know we can put in place climate mitigation measures on our farms. So surely that's all we really need to do. Well, I'm afraid not. We do have large-scale targets within Scotland, or very ambitious targets within Scotland. We've got 2 million hectares of peatland, but 80% of that peatland is degraded in some way. We're looking to restore over 600,000 hectares by 2045. And we've only got 18% of our land cover in Scotland is under woodland. That's one of the lowest in Europe. Certainly UK and Ireland have the lowest woodland cover than most elsewhere in Europe itself. We have an aspiration to get up to 20% of land cover by 2032, and we've got targets in place to create currently 12,000 hectares of new woodland per year, and that's going to rise to 18,000 hectares of new woodland per year by 2045. However, having targets is only one part of the equation. It's making sure that those outcomes are achievable that is key. And Jerry and colleagues wanted us to emphasise in these presentations, where is the information gap? Where is the research needs? So with regard to peatlands, we know where our peatlands are in Scotland, but how do we actually prioritise where is the best place to actually target peatland restoration in the first instance in order to actually have the biggest return on that investment? Woodland, we can put in a variety of woodlands in Scotland and a variety of scales, but what scale and what purpose should that woodland actually have in any one particular area? And because most of Scotland is under farmland, how do we engage with farmers to get them doing more peatland restoration? How do we engage with farmers to get them doing more woodland creation? And how do we actually integrate particularly the woodland element of things into farming systems? So this is just a piece of work, or an example of a piece of work done by a private company in association with Nature Scot, that's our nature conservation agency in Scotland, and others. The red is not showing where peatlands exist in Scotland. The red is showing where peatlands exist in Scotland, and it's estimated that if we prioritised peatland restoration action at those red areas, then that is where we would get much more quicker return in terms of capping emissions and starting to sequester carbon as possible. And I mentioned, how do you actually engage and integrate farmers into woodland creation? Our colleague Rob McMorran has just completed some work with one of our national parks, where he was looking at why are farmers more reluctant to engage in woodland creation and management within the national park or elsewhere within Scotland. So there's still a lot of engagement, research and demonstration needed, and understanding as to what are the techniques to actually identify where best to prioritise some of these nature-based solution management actions. And of course, those of you that know Scotland well, it's very remote. Most of where we will be applying these nature-based solutions are remote areas of Scotland. So how do we go about measuring that the benefit that we are actually seeking is actually being provided? So at our farm up in the Highlands, we've got very little connectivity in terms of, well, we don't even have 4G, we're lucky if we actually have G, but we are looking at Internet of Things type technology, putting in low power wide area radio networks and connecting those to sensors around the farm to try and give us more information to inform on-farm management decisions, as well as inform whether management actions we've taken are starting to result in the benefit that we actually desire. And certainly that type of sensor technology of a wide variety of types is an area that we are actively working in, but an area that requires more people to be working in as we go forward, both from a climate change and a biodiversity perspective. And Hannah Marie is going to be talking about carbon later on. Carbon in the mountains of Scotland is highly important, given the carbon sequestration potential. These are two different maps of the higher part of our farm, two valleys next to each other with mountains in between. These carbon store estimates, and they are estimates, are based on old school calculations, based on what we know about the soil type and what we know about the type of vegetation that's on that sort of soil on the left-hand side, or what we're estimating in terms of the amount of carbon stored in the vegetation on the right-hand side. But as I'm sure Hannah Marie will go into, these back of the envelope type estimates are not necessarily going to be what we actually need in reality. If anybody is entering into a contract that whereby they're going to undertake to store a certain level of carbon into the future. We need more accurate ways of measuring, and also ways of measuring more regularly how our carbon stores are actually changing. And this, on the left-hand side, the colours are just different vegetation types in the same two valleys, the same two glens. And on the right-hand side, the darker the colour is where we're estimating that there is greater flood mitigation potential, i.e. the vegetation could be acting to hold water back at times of extreme rainfall events. Again, these are estimates. Some of the sensor technology we're deploying is looking to test whether these estimates are actually true in reality after rainfall events. And it may seem strange that upland livestock systems are looking to actually manage water, but as far as Scotland is concerned, and many other mountainous areas of the world, the map on the left-hand side here is all our water courses in Scotland. The blue and the green is where our water quality is deemed to be good, and you can see that largely tracks where the mountainous areas occurs, the purple areas in the map you saw earlier on. So our water quality issues are more down in the low ground areas where you see the yellows and the browns and the reds occurring on the map. But actually, the big important management issue going forward for the uplands of Scotland is managing water quantity. We have over 250 areas of Scotland, mostly towns and villages, mostly in the low ground, that are at risk, deemed to be at risk from flooding. And we're seeing, like elsewhere in Europe, we're seeing more and more flood events occurring more regularly. And so how we manage our uplands of Scotland will be vitally important going forward, not just solely from a livestock production perspective or a biodiversity perspective, but managing water quality will be vitally important. And that means we need to actually have metrics. Setting targets, putting action in place is all very well, but if we can't measure whether that action is actually having the required benefits, or whether those required benefits are actually happening quick enough in order to allow us to actually meet our targets for 2030, to know we're on track for 2045, then we need more in the way of a wider suite of metrics to allow us to judge how well our land management changes, or land management practice changes on farming or on farmland across Europe are actually operating. Without metrics, then we know nothing at all. So I'm just going to finish there. Hopefully you'll get the access to a PDF of the presentation afterwards. There's some links there to podcasts and videos about what we're doing on the farm, and more importantly, why. And I will just acknowledge our funders and actually stop there. So thank you very much, Jerry. Hopefully that was within the timescale you were looking for.
Oh, that was excellent, Davy, and thanks for reminding me to mention that, of course, the presentations will be available on the EurAgri website after the event today. Actually, Davy, some of the slides you presented there I thought was a fantastic tourism promotion for Scotland. So hopefully when the restrictions on COVID ease, we'll be heading over there. Just one question that has come in online that I think is quite interesting is the role of livestock in these systems on the highlands, and the importance of livestock to the promotion of biodiversity, and again the challenges of managing livestock in these environments.
Yep. So I've worked for well over 30 years now in sort of farming and wildlife interactions, particularly across Europe, and particularly across what we now call high nature value farming systems, many of which are now remaining in our upland areas. And so many of our livestock farming systems in mountainous areas across Europe are regarded as being of high nature conservation value, because the grazing and other management practices associated with those livestock systems are deemed to be important, or are important, for producing the vegetation conditions that are important for a wide variety of the sort of habitats and the species that we put high nature conservation value upon. Our difficulty at the moment is twofold. One, across Europe and now increasingly within Scotland, we've been seeing abandonment of those livestock systems in the mountains for many decades. And if you abandon the livestock system or intensify it, but if you abandon it, you're losing the benefit from the biodiversity perspective. The second issue that we actually have, as Jerry was probably alluding to, is trying to actually get people wider to understand that many of these climate change, biodiversity, livestock farming system interactions, they're not binary. It's not stop this and you'll get this benefit, do that and you'll stop that. Actually, it's trying to get them to understand that there are actually trade-offs associated with livestock farming systems. Jerry said at the start, they can be part of the problem, but they are also an important part of the solution. And for many of our biodiversity issues in the uplands, we need farmers, we need farming systems, and we need farmers. And we also need those farmers to be doing the other type of management actions that are going to be important going forward to address climate change issues. Without farmers, we lose the ability to actually manage the land. And I cannot think of anywhere in Europe where we have environmental NGOs who have sufficient capacity to take on the management of 70% of Scotland's agricultural land, for example, to manage it purely from a biodiversity perspective. Farmers are key to the management going forward.
Thanks, Davy. And we may come back to, I'm sure we'll come back to some of these points and related points at the end of the three presentations. I mean, one thing I thought that resonated with me very strongly, one point you mentioned, was that I think there's been an obsession about targets, and even at COP that came through. But it's the delivery and implementation of the targets that's the real challenge, and indeed for research as well. That's where we need to understand what motivates, particularly in the case where farmers are managing peatlands, grazing purposes, for example, livestock production. What incentives will they need to perhaps change their management practices, and what investment will be required as well? So, and I think that's a theme for research in my view. So let's move on now to our second speaker, and this is Anna Maria Ahonen, who works as a senior consultant with Perspectives Climate Group. And again, this was another session that I thought was really interesting, because while it focused on the international trading of carbon and the issues around the Article 6, so-called Article 6 in respect of the management, if you like, and the rules governing such trade, I think it has also relevance to within-country trading. Some of the principles, I think, apply as well. And I think in the next few years, we're going to have to see more and more discussion about how such systems might be incorporated within a European context. So, Anna-Marie, we're delighted to have you this morning. So invite you now to make your presentation. And again, reminding everyone, please get in your questions. We'll try and get to them, all of them in due course. Okay, Anna-Marie.
Thank you very much, Jerry, and Davy as well. Let me see if I can get you to see my screen, and I need to be able to somehow change.
If you go, you see the display. Do you see display settings on the top of your screen? The next.
Well, it's actually blocked because of my.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, look.
Okay, I will go with this in that case. You'll get a bit of a preview, but never mind. I don't have any notes.
No, we can
so
see
you
it.
get to see my secret notes anyway.
No,
unfortunately, it's blocked by the sort of toolbar. But anyway, so I will be focusing on carbon markets. And just as Davy was saying, it's really not just about the targets, it's about the metrics and the mitigation outcomes. And that's what carbon markets are all about, providing incentives if you have achieved the outcomes, and financial incentives for achieving the outcomes, and creating a financial incentive for getting a mitigation outcome specifically. And that is sort of the bigger philosophy of carbon markets. And as you were saying, Jerry, This is something that's relevant for in-house. Okay, now I can do that. Excellent. In-house in-country trading and international trading. The logic is exactly the same. So regardless of which one we're talking about, there is a lot that is relevant also for domestic trading and EU trading and so forth. So it's all about the metrics and the outcomes and rewarding them. So I would start with a few key concepts because even if they are familiar, they are very much changing and evolving at the moment. And it is a bit of a confusing area with a lot of secret language and secret terms. And I'm trying to unpack them a little bit because the logic behind this is quite straightforward, even if the secret language kind of mystifies it. So let's try to demystify it a little bit. First of all, carbon markets is a very wide concept. There's two main types of carbon market schemes, and often people work in one or the other. And but there's the cap and trade schemes, which are like the EU ETS, for example, and they issue ex-ante emission allowances. And then there are baseline and credit schemes outside of these capped environments that reward mitigation outcomes afterwards, once they've been issued, once the metrics have been demonstrated, by issuing ex-post carbon credits. And mitigation outcome now means an emission reduction or a removal. And this removal side is very important for the agricultural sector. And the carbon markets, basically these carbon market schemes, both allowances and carbon credits represent 1 ton carbon dioxide equivalent, but the one is a right to emit, but the other one is a reward for managing to mitigate. So they have a little bit of a different nature, but they're the same ton, the same metric. And these units are traded in carbon markets, but there's different segments. So the EU ETS is its own carbon market segment, if you wish, and that's for the compliance. And so in the compliance market, you have the allowances, but they're also supplemented with some carbon credits that are eligible and intertradable with allowances with some restrictions. And these are used for compliance. But then there's also the voluntary carbon markets, and they focus on carbon credits, and they don't really trade on allowances, although you could in theory. And so these are all part of the bigger carbon markets. And then there are different standards that issue these carbon credits, and these are relevant because a lot of these are options, alternatives that when you have a project developer who wants to get credits, they have to choose between one or the other standard, and there's different types. So some international standards like the CDM, which was under the Kyoto Protocol for developing countries. There's also JI for developed countries, but that doesn't work anymore. And now the new Article 6.4 mechanism under the Paris Agreement is an international standard for generating carbon credits. Then there's bilateral standards. Japan has its own standard. And then there's independent standards that like the gold standard, the verified carbon standard. And then in the US, there is ACR and CAR, and they have lots of methodologies also for the land use sector. So all different types of standards issuing carbon credits. And then if we look at the Article 6, it's from the Paris Agreement's perspective, it provides for voluntary carbon market-based cooperation, also non-market-based, but we're not looking at that now. And Article 6.2, and I'm sorry they don't have nicer names, it's really about every time there is some cooperation that involves the international transfer of mitigation outcomes, there are some rules, and Article 6 provides for those rules and criteria. Article 6.4 creates an actual mechanism. It's an international baseline and credit mechanism for generating carbon credits under the supervision of the Paris Agreement. Now, although we got the final rules in Glasgow for Article 6, it was the only part that hadn't been finalized earlier. It doesn't mean it was the first time or the last time we're going to get Article 6 rules. It's an iterative process. And just a little bit about my background, I've been working on carbon markets for almost 20 years now. So I watched the evolution of the voluntary carbon markets, which were in their early days back when I started. And also the first round of international mechanisms, so the CDM under the Kyoto Protocol. And they had rules in 2001, and then they had rules every year afterwards for quite a while. So it is very much an ongoing process. So we don't have the final rules now. And already in Paris in 2015, a lot of important things were agreed that we knew, and we've been knowing the whole time, that Article 6 cooperation needs to allow for higher ambition. It needs to ensure environmental integrity, and that is to do with the metrics and really getting the metrics right. Also, transparency is really important, so you can judge the quality. Robust accounting is important, so you don't double count and then you don't use the same credits in many different ways. And then sustainable development has always been on paper a criteria, but now in the Paris Agreement, because of a lot of criticism, it is becoming more and more important also in practice. Now in Katowice in 2018, there was some additional agreement on the reporting side that mentioned Article 6, and that introduced the use of these internationally transferred mitigation outcomes for other purposes, not just for meeting the Paris Agreement's national targets, but also for other purposes. And this opened the window for using the Article 6 system also for the voluntary carbon markets, and then for the International Aviation's CORSIA scheme. So it's not just for meeting the targets anymore, it is for a variety of purposes, and that's why this is interesting also beyond if you're a country trying to meet your target under the Paris Agreement. Now in Glasgow, we agreed on the rules for operationalizing Article 6, but next year we'll get more rules, and the year after we'll get more rules. So it is very much a process. And these rules go to very much detail in terms of how to do the metrics, how to ensure the quality, and all sorts of different aspects. So it is very technical. It's more technical than a lot of the other aspects in the Paris Agreement. And that's what made it so hard to agree as well. It also has political things that made it extra hard to agree. And now the carbon markets, they started kind of, you have voluntary carbon markets and you had credits and standards catering for the voluntary market. And then you had compliance markets and standards catering for those. That's all nice and pretty. However, that's not how it is in real life. So all of these crediting standards cater for all of these different market segments. So they aren't anymore, they might have been originally designed for one, but they are now being catering for all different types of market segments, because these crediting standards are kind of alternatives to each other. And this means that actually criteria coming from one of the market segment influences all of the crediting standards. And these criteria are starting to align regardless of which standard you're using in terms of the big environmental integrity criteria, for example. And there might be some different types of units that these crediting standards are generating, which would be eligible for a particular market segment. So not all credits from all of these standards are eligible for all of these market segments, but there is a lot of influence across each other and also domestically. And this is where the domestics, so the EU ETS cap and trade, or even the South African carbon tax, is actually recognizing some of these international independent standards. And this is why, even if you don't use Article 6, it might influence whatever you are using for metrics for your project in the agricultural sector, for example. And if we're looking at voluntary use of carbon credits, this is something that's increased hugely in the past couple of years. It's been around for 20 years, but now that more and more companies, the number of companies has gone from 0 to 3,000 or something, that are making net zero targets. And all sorts of claims related to their products and their own carbon footprint. And it is a very unstandardized situation how these credits are used and how they're claimed, because it's voluntary, so there hasn't been any particular universal guidance on it. So it's been very organically developing. But the principles have been there the whole time in terms of best practice. And the first premises is that actors should always do own mitigation. But even if they do, there will be some remaining emissions. And that's where the voluntary use of carbon credit kicks in. And then the way we use voluntary compensation is a broader word that includes both offsetting and non-offsetting uses, but some others use it in different ways. So be careful about these terms because they're not even used in a standardized way. But for the purpose of this presentation, voluntary compensation is when you are taking responsibility for your remaining emissions and you want to compensate for the fact that you have some emissions. Offsetting means buying carbon credits based on mitigation achieved outside of your boundaries, using some of those standards. and using those carbon credits to counterbalance these remaining emissions. Now, non-offsetting is really not linking these carbon credits to your own emissions. It's just supporting mitigation on top of your own action outside of your value chain. So it really depends on whether you want to counterbalance your emissions or not. And that really is manifested by the claim you make. So a carbon neutrality claim is basically meaning that I have now counterbalanced my emissions, thus I'm carbon neutral. And net zero is a similar claim, but somewhat different, and they're very much evolving at the moment. Whereas if you're non-offsetting, you're simply saying you're doing a contribution to mitigation outside of your value chain, but not linking it to your own remaining emissions. And this is a terminology, if it feels confusing, don't worry, I do this on a full-time basis and it's still confusing for me. And this is not the only way it's been used, but this is how it's starting to emerge in the international discussions. But now going back to Article 6, and I will tell how these two are linked at the end. So what was agreed in Glasgow? For Article 6.2, it's basically the rules for any cooperation that involves the international transfer of mitigation outcomes. The important thing that came out of it was that they defined an internationally transferred mitigation outcome. Interestingly, an internationally transferred mitigation outcome does not need to be international or transferred. So the name is somewhat misleading because of the history of how this came up. But what an ITMO is, it's real, verified, and additional emission reduction or removal. So it's really, it's a metric and it's an outcome of actions. And what makes it an ITMO is that it's authorized by the host country for particular use. And that use could be towards an NDC, which is the Paris target. It could be authorized for use for international mitigation purposes, which would be the international aviation, the CORSIA, or it could be authorized for other purposes as defined by the host country. So it could be authorized for a lot of different things and not necessarily international. And the important thing is once this is authorized by a host country, then the host country has to give up the right to count this mitigation outcome towards its NDC. And then it's available to be counted for these other purposes. And this is done by doing a corresponding adjustment on the emissions balance of the host country. So the host country doesn't count it towards its NDC. It means it's available for going beyond the host country's NDC. And this avoids double counting. And this was a really important thing that hadn't been agreed properly. And that's what prevented the agreement on Article 6 rules in the past. And then if you have carbon credits coming from the Article 6 mechanism, if they are authorized by the host country for these uses, they become ITMOs, just like these other types. And then once the host country authorizes these ITMOs, it needs to report to the UN, the Paris Agreement. How does it ensure that these are good quality? How is double counted avoided? How is sustainable development promoted? How are human rights, rights of indigenous peoples, and gender equality taken into consideration? And all of this has to be reported. So the host country takes responsibility on the things that they authorize. And this reporting is subject to a UN review. And so that's maybe the important thing about Article 6.2. What is an ITMO? It is something that the host country gives up and doesn't count towards its own emissions so that it can be used by others. And now if we look at the Article 6.4, it's a mechanism that generates these credits under the guidance and supervision of the Paris Agreement and a supervisory body. And that is really where the technical work happens. There's requirements for mechanism methodologies, and that's where the metrics come in. But not only the technical side, it's also about local stakeholder consultation, environmental and social safeguards, and sustainable development assessments, also the negative, not just the positive, as Davey was talking about, the trade-offs as well. And this is something that the carbon markets have been criticized a lot about, because if they are not of good quality, they can actually undermine mitigation efforts rather than contribute to them. And that's why it's so incredibly important to get these qualities right. And then there are things like the activity cycle. That's very similar to the CDM. So it's the same as in the past. Crediting periods aligned with the national target periods. And importantly, maybe for removals, there will be guidance on how to address non-permanence, because it's important to make sure that these outcomes are also permanent if they are being used by others to then counterbalance their own emissions. Also, leakage is important also in the land use sector, and negative environmental social impacts. And as a new aspect, now carbon market are to encourage ambition over time. So it's not just looking at whether it's better than business as usual. It is this in line with the long-term target of the Paris Agreement? And does this actually take us towards where we need to go? And that is a new aspect that we don't have experience from the past, because in the past, we just had emission reductions as long as they were below business as usual, that was sufficient. Now they also have to be in line with the long-term targets. There's mandatory levies for adaptation administration and also an overall mitigation in global emissions. So that's an extra sort of ambition tax, if you wish. And that's where a lot of the political negotiations were focused on. And then the controversial issue, or the price for agreeing that double counting will be avoided across this. This is very important so that you don't count the same mitigation twice. The cost for agreeing that was transitioning old credits from the pre-2021 period into the Paris Agreement period. So some of those old activities that have been registered 2016 onwards can then move and register under the Article 6.4 mechanism. But also old credits issued in the past will be available for use for the first NDCs for a limited period. And this is something that if you hear the criticism, this is mostly where the criticism really focuses on. The actual rules are very robust. I'm really happy with the rules. I was in Paris negotiating Article 6. And so I was personally very excited to see that we got the good rules, because for a long time we decided not to agree on rules if they're going to be bad rules, because bad rules are going to undermine ambition, and it's better to have no rules than bad rules. And I think we got the good rules, and then we have old credits that might be good quality credits but don't really help the need for new ambition. And then finally, bringing all this together, how does this link to the voluntary carbon markets? And the reason I'm bringing up the voluntary carbon markets, because I'm working on it a lot, and a lot of the money and the demand for these credits is actually coming from the voluntary side rather than the governments at the moment. I'm also working with some governments that are already piloting Article 6 and really developing what do these principles mean in practice for actual activities on the ground. But these also, as I showed with all the linkages, could be merged so that the voluntary buyers could use these governments' Article 6 pilots to access these credits. So the distinctions are very blurred these days. But if just summarizing, sort of bringing all of this together, and I know this might sound very technical and confusing, but if you have a mitigation activity, whether emission reductions or removals, to access the carbon markets, you would need to go through the baseline credit scheme. We're forgetting about the emissions trading schemes for now. I'm looking at the baseline and credits schemes, and there's options for going through different standards. So Article 6.4 mechanism is one, if you want to go through the UN. There's independent standards, and there's all sorts of multilateral standards also emerging. So there's a variety to choose from. And all of them have similar principles, but a little bit different ways of ensuring that those principles. And then they come up with a type of unit or a mitigation outcome. So the Article 6.4 mechanism generates Article 6.4 emission reductions. I'm really sorry that they didn't come up with a nicer name for the unit, A6.4ER. And different independent standards generate their own certified carbon credits, and then there just might be mitigation outcomes. And these could also be domestic standards, by the way, the Woodland Code or the Peatland Code. And now, if you go to the host country and the host country gives an authorization, that means that it will make a corresponding adjustment, meaning that the host country will not count it towards its own target. You have an ITMO. That credit becomes an ITMO. And this ITMO can be used. OMG is the overall mitigation in global emissions, which is the ambition tax. You can use it for other countries' NDCs, their targets. You can use it for CORSIA if you're an international aviation company. And then you can use it for voluntary purposes. So these were all the different uses that the host country can authorize it for. Now, if you don't get this authorization, you still have a mitigation outcome, but then that's counting towards the host country's target. And then you can use it for domestic policies. You can use it for results-based finance. And these are helping the host country to achieve its targets. And you can also use it for the voluntary markets. Now, the big debate in the voluntary market is, okay, can you use both of them for all types of claims? Can you use both types with and without corresponding adjustments for offsetting and non-offsetting or not? And that's something that is debate on whether you should only use one type for a particular claim, because the voluntary use includes different types of claims. And so finally, Article 6 does not directly regulate voluntary uses, but it does influence the voluntary market by setting a global standard. And these independent crediting standards that do cater for the voluntary markets are aligning with the Paris Agreement and all of its principles. So there are revisions on how they do their metrics to take into account the national targets. They're also labeling credits. So they're labeling credits for different types of uses, labeling credits that have a corresponding adjustment and labeling credits that have not. And so it means that the Article 6 ITMO process and the mechanism are available for voluntary uses, but they're not required. There is no authority, that global authority requiring that. Article 6.2, you would want to use if you want to go to ambition raising and you want to use voluntary carbon markets to raise ambition beyond the host country's targets. Article 6 you would use if you want a UN quality control on the carbon credit itself and the metrics and use the methodologies. So the voluntary use of Article 6 is really motivated by ambition raising, credibility and reputation risk, not because you have to, but because you might want to for these reasons. And this debate about what kind of credits are credibly available for use for voluntary offset and non-offset, that is the main debate in the voluntary market right now. Nobody really questions that ITMOs can be used credibly for offset-based claims like carbon neutrality claims, but there are diverging views whether it's credible to use a mitigation outcome that also counts towards the host country target for carbon neutrality claims. And there's wide agreement that if you use mitigation outcomes without a corresponding adjustment, you help the host country and you can do credible non-offset based claims, which really are about helping the host country to meet its target. So even you could help the Ireland meet its targets and you would have this kind of domestic scheme. Now, this is the big debate and the guidance is happening outside of the Article 6. So we're not going to look to Article 6 to guide on this particular debate. And so how to use carbon credits and which credits to use, which claims and what is credible, and to get standardized claims is something that's under work in the international sphere. There's a voluntary carbon market integrity initiative, which is financed in the UK, that is developing this guidance right now. And I'm working on the Nordic dialogue on voluntary compensation, and we're developing best practice guidance for the Nordic stakeholders. Consumer authorities are paying increasing attention to these claims. For example, in Denmark and Sweden, there's been the case of Arla marketing their dairy products as net zero. And this is now being questioned by the consumer agencies whether this is a valid claim and whether it's misleading or not. So you're getting case law from that perspective, very much to do with actually the food industry's carbon neutrality claims. But finally, the global stakeholders will be the judge on what kind of carbon credit use and claims are credible in their eyes. And just as a final sentence, the carbon markets have been subject to a lot of criticism in the past. And their value is basically, it's linked to their credibility. And it depends on how the global stakeholders, owners, employers, NGOs feel that the carbon market, is it contributing or undermining? Is it good quality or not? The perception of that trust is really important for the entire value. And without that value, the money doesn't flow. So this is how Article 6 does and does not influence the carbon market. But that was my presentation. Thank you very much. And over to you, Jerry.
Thank you, Hannah Marie. And clearly, for a lot of us that we're listening to, and indeed from myself in particular, this is a highly technical matter when it comes to, and you have to have rules for international trading, very clearly defined rules. But I think I really appreciate the benefit of your expertise because, as you say, you have 20 years experience in this area. And I certainly think the potential exists within Europe. If you just focus on the potential of the agriculture and land use sector to remove carbon, by changing land use, that there has to be a role for a market mechanism that provides incentives to land users within a European context. I'm going to ask Sylvia. Sylvia, you've been monitoring the questions coming in online. Are there any questions you'd like to put to Anne-Marie, please?
Okay, there are several questions. There are 3 questions for the moment. Maybe we can take 2 and keep the other one for later. So the first question is on the side effects related to the prime targets of carbon market mechanisms. So the question is, there are positive side effects on other societal targets like health issues for city bed air. Is an example, but there are also counter aspects to these prime targets. So how to deal with them, how to take them into consideration. And the second question is also an important one. Has agriculture or food systems been discussed in the context of carbon markets?
Thank you, Sylvia. Anne-Marie?
Yes, so I guess on the co-benefits and potential positive and negative co-impacts, that's something that has been discussed a lot in the history of carbon markets, and there are some standards that have developed tools to assess both the negative and the positive impacts, so that you know more about those impacts, because the carbon markets actually include a really diverse amount of different types of activities. You can't say anything specific about the impacts because it depends always on the underlying activity, whether it's renewable energy or forestry or landfill capture or whatnot. But there are tools that have been developed, and the Article 6 mechanism will also develop tools for assessing both the positive and negative impacts, putting in place safeguards, and then communicating and monitoring those impacts. And there might be some price premiums for those that have those positive co-benefits, and there has been a market for those already. But I think the important thing here is that when you say you have some impacts, you say you don't have negative impacts, you can prove that with some systematic tools. In terms of agriculture, I think I'm not so familiar with those standards that are working a lot with the carbon and agriculture, because I think they're mostly in the US, in the California and Quebec system. There has been some domestic credits that you can use for those trading schemes that are to do with agriculture. But because there's challenges with the metrics and challenges with permanence, they have not been the main activity type in the voluntary carbon markets, and especially not the compliance Kyoto markets, because you have activities that are easier to measure and easier to prove. And if it's a difficult area of proving, then it costs more to prove. But that's an area where then the carbon markets also aim to move towards the more difficult areas and the more hard to abate areas. So there is a real need to develop more and more methodologies for the metrics for agriculture so that they can enter the carbon markets. So I think that would be the short answer. Of course, there would be a longer answer as well, but I'm aware of the time.
Thank you, Hannah-Marie. And I think the point that you mentioned there in relation to the importance of metrics is a critical point for your agri members. And indeed, Davy referred to it as well. It's a real research challenge. I mean, particularly in relation to the potential of land use practices to remove carbon. And we absolutely need, certainly across Europe, a systematic approach to measurement and a standard, and the cost, the investment cost required to put in place those metrics, is clearly a substantial one, but it's a really, really urgent research question. And that's, I guess, one of the questioners earlier, one of the questions earlier was, we're looking at a trajectory for global warming that's substantially in excess without immediate action of the 1.5 degrees Celsius. So time is a concern here in relation to putting in place these metrics and mitigation measures. Thank you, Hannah Marie. And again, reminding everyone there'll be an opportunity to ask further questions at the end of the final presentation, which we move on to now. And I neglected earlier, I did mention Simon Oosting from Wageningen University Research, but I forgot to mention, of course, his colleague who will also be presenting on the topic of methane in particular, and that's Dr. Corina van Middelaar. And my apologies earlier, Corina, for not mentioning, giving you credit. So, Simon, I leave you and Corina introduce yourselves and make the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, audience, dear, welcome to our presentation entitled Sustainable Livestock Systems and Methane. And as Jerry already told, I invited Corina van Middelaar to join me in this presentation because she is the expert in our animal production systems group at Wageningen University. She's the expert on greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And I'm Simon Oosting, and I'm leading the group. Now, can you move it on? The outline for today is climate impact of greenhouse gas emissions, so how important is methane, the background of methane. The methane pledge at COP26, what was it actually about? Cattle as main contributor, where does it happen? We make a distinction between the developed world and the developing world. And then in the end, we reflect on methane and sustainability.
So first, a little bit of background. So what are we actually talking about when we focus on methane? And how important is methane, for example, in comparison to carbon dioxide? And to address that question, I want to go into the background of the climate impact and then the behavior of CO2 and methane. In this graph, we see the radiative forcing related to an emission pulse, so a one-time emission of 1 million tons of CO2 and methane in year one. And the radiative forcing is directly related to the climate impact of the greenhouse gases. And the radiative forcing over time is directly related to their atmospheric lifetime. So CO2 has a very long atmospheric lifetime. It takes up to hundreds of thousands of years before it's fully eliminated from the atmosphere. Methane, on the other hand, has a much shorter atmospheric lifetime. So within a few decades, it's fully broken down to CO2. Methane, on the other hand, has a much higher radiative forcing. So please also notice the difference in scale on the y-axis. So when we now plot a continuous flow of the two emissions, we get the following picture. So because of the difference in atmospheric lifetime, we see that the pictures intrinsically differ. Whereas carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere, a continuous flow of methane results in a stabilized radiative forcing. That doesn't mean that methane isn't important, of course. So reducing methane is very important because it has a severe climate impact. However, we also have to realize that the stable flux of methane doesn't result in an increased warming, whereas for CO2, every pulse or every flux of CO2 does result in an increased warming. So when we discuss the reduction of methane, I think we have to remember that this should not be at the expense of reducing carbon dioxide.
So methane is special, and addressing methane, well, could be a first step. And as Corina said, don't forget about CO2. But that's why some world leaders pledged at the COP26 to reduce methane emissions by 30% in 2030 and compared with the 2020 emissions. And more than 100 countries followed, not China, not India, Australia, and Russia. And 30% of anthropogenic emissions, that's how I interpret the pledge, corresponds to 18.2% of all emissions, because not all emissions are anthropogenic. For example, wetlands emit quite a lot of greenhouse of methane, approximately 50% of the total emissions come from wetlands. So the emissions where we humans can do something about correspond to 18.2%, which is still quite ambitious if we would meet that target, because this would reduce the atmospheric methane concentrations from about 1900 parts per billion, which we have today, to approximately 1550 parts per billion, which is the level of 1980. So we would go more than 40 years back in time if we would achieve that. Well, various sectors should act, because it's livestock, enteric fermentation, the fermentation in the rumen of ruminants, it contributes for 30% to the anthropogenic methane emissions, manure for 4%, but fossil fuel production is also at almost 30%, and waste and landfills contribute for 20%. So work to do for many sectors.
Yeah, so Simon just mentioned the agricultural and waste sector is a very important contributor. On the left-hand graph, we see the distribution of methane from these sectors across the world. On the right-hand graph, we see the distribution of cattle across the world. And because of the importance of enteric fermentation, obviously, there is a relation, or the two pictures have similar patterns. The distribution across the world also actually indicates that there is probably not a one-size-fits-all solution to reduce methane from cattle, and that livestock systems actually intrinsically differ between different regions in the world. And that's why in this presentation, we want to distinguish between the developed and the developing world. So first, the developed world. In this graph, we see the greenhouse gas emission intensity per kilogram of milk. So this is the sum of CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide expressed in kilograms of CO2 equivalents per unit of fat and protein corrected milk in the various regions in the world. And the general picture actually shows that in the developed regions, in general, greenhouse gas emission intensities are lower. And this is because these systems are generally characterized by higher animal productivity and also high quality diets. So when we want to reduce methane emissions in such type of systems, options that are often proposed are feeding and breeding or management strategies. So examples of feeding strategies to reduce enteric methane emissions are for the addition of feed additives, so to manipulate the rumen, increasing feed quality, dietary manipulation, such as the coating of starch, for example, so it bypasses the rumen and therefore reduces methane emissions, but also precision feeding. Examples of management and breeding strategies are further increasing productivity, improving health of the animals, and reducing animal mortality. So when we have less animals that are non-productive, we also have a lower greenhouse gas emission intensity per kilogram of milk produced. What I would like to address that when we target methane emission, we are very much likely to also affect other processes along the production chain, in this case of milk. So for example, when we change the feed towards a diet that reduces methane emissions, we might find ourselves in a situation where carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide emissions related to the production of feed increase. And as I said before, there is quite a big difference between short-lived and long-lived greenhouse gas emissions. So we should be aware of these trade-offs and also make sure that we don't counter actually the impact that we aim for. During my PhD, I also looked at the integral consequences of different feeding and breeding strategies. And I wanted to take the example of a feeding strategy that results in quite a reduction in methane emissions. So expressed in kilograms of CO2 equivalents per unit of milk, so the greenhouse gas emission intensity, this feeding linseed could result in a reduction of methane of 12%. But when we looked at the changes in other processes along the chain, we found that the emissions related to feed production mainly increased by 11%. So These two figures are both expressed in kilograms of CO2 equivalents per kilogram of milk produced. So what it shows actually that there might be a considerable trade-off, and that in this case, the net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions is not that high as that we would like to have when just looking at methane. Similarly, I think it's also important to look to the consequences outside the production system. So the continuous focus on increasing productivity in the Western world, for example, has also resulted in the fact that we use quite a lot of high quality products in the diets of animals. And these products could also be consumed by humans directly. And I think from both the perspective of food security and the environmental sustainability, this might not be the required path to go. Similarly, when we focus on a single production chain, we might also overlook other consequences. So by increasing milk productivity per cow, we change the ratio between the milk and the meat produced by the dairy sector. And then we might question what product would replace this meat that's now produced in a fewer amount, basically. So are these plant products or are these other animal products? So if we want to effectively reduce the emissions, we might want to look at the food system as a whole instead of just focusing on individual production chains or sectors.
So the other part of the world is the developing regions, and there, well, there's also a narrative around reduction of methane from those areas. Feed quality relates to the methane emission intensity, so the amount of methane that's produced per kilo of milk, for example. And this is illustrated in this graph. On the x-axis is the feed quality and digestibility of the organic matter. And it shows that at high levels of digestibility, the emission intensity is relatively low, but it goes exponentially up for low feed quality values. And I have an example here from the Netherlands and Indonesia, where I looked at existing diets for dairy cattle. On the x-axis, I plotted the feed quality, again, in digestibility of organic matter, and this is a class of digestibility. So 55-60 means the feed quality is in between 55 and 60% of the DOM. And on the y-axis is the percentage of those ingredients in the diet. And you see here in the blue and orange curves that in Indonesia, the dietary quality is relatively low if you compare it to the Netherlands, where actually the worst quality feed in the Netherlands is as good as the very best quality feeds in Indonesia. So feed quality is an issue in the tropics. Not easy to get more high quality feeds there, as Corina already said. High quality feeds requires land on which you could also grow food crops directly for human consumption. So let's look at the animal numbers, because one thing to achieve higher production per animal is by cutting down the numbers. Well, I expressed here in this table the large ruminant numbers times a million for the world in 1980 and 2019. I took 1980 because that's the year where we want to go back to with a concentration of methane in the air. Well, and you see that in Europe, we had a reduction of the animal number by more than 50%. Americas, it increased slightly, and Oceania, there was no increase at all, but a big increase of animal numbers in Africa and Asia. So not really to expect easily that that there will be less animals to emit methane on short term. And there's a very interesting relationship in this graph here. It's among how many animals should we have and what can you expect of productivity. The blue curve is a kind of shows that there is a kind of optimal productivity in a hectare of land. Then you talk about stocking rate, and that's well known. Stocking rate has an optimal, but it also counts in a region or in a country or even in a whole continent. If you do or cannot import feeds, you're stuck to this relation. So there is an optimum, a maximum milk production for a limited number of animals. And the orange curve depicts the methane emissions of the same region. And you see that increases, of course, with the increasing animal number. Well, so the best would be to be on top of the curve. But what you often see is that the actual number of animals is much higher than the level for optimal production. So people keep more animals than maximum or than good for production. And that has a reason. I explain in this graph, because in the tropics, livestock is often kept in mixed crop livestock systems. So there's crop and livestock in the system at the same moment. And in those systems, animals have multiple roles, and they are depicted in this poster on the right-hand side. Animals are there to produce manure. Manure can be used as fertilizer or as fuel. Animals are there for draft power. About half of the acres in the world are being plowed by oxen. And livestock has a banking and insurance function. So you can store wealth in animals, and the moment you need money, you can sell the animal again. Those are all functions that go well with increasing livestock number. The more animals you have, the stronger the manure function, the plowing function, or the banking function. And only for meat and milk, you have this optimal function. And in such systems, in these mixed crop livestock systems, meat and milk are only of secondary importance always. So what could we do in order to reduce methane is to put attention to the reduction of the importance of these livelihood functions of livestock. So if we would develop a good banking and insurance system in the third world, no extra or even a reduction of herd size can be obtained because animals are not needed for that anymore. Same with manure, which we could replace by fertilizers being produced preferably by renewable energy, and also mechanization to replace the oxen could be ways out. So the solution for methane could be in a different kind of projects.
So then a concluding slide. So what about methane and sustainability? I think first of all, a no regret solution, so to speak, is to reduce the animal numbers. And in the developed regions, it should be by a change on consumption patterns of human. So consume less animal products. In developing regions, this should be, like Simon said, to find appropriate solutions to the multifunctionality of livestock. And then in addition to that, we should produce sustainably. So I think the first question, whether or not we should produce in regions with the least impact, is a very valid question. But it's also a very difficult question to answer because, well, I think there are already many aspects addressed. So it's not just about methane, it's also about the cultural and the economic context of the system, about the availability of resources, about the livelihoods of people. So all this should be taken into account when you want to have a good answer to the question where and how we should produce in regions with the least impact. In addition to that, when we, for example, choose to produce in certain regions, we should also respect the local environment. We should make sure that the local impact related to nitrogen and phosphorus pollution is not accelerated. But also, it's also about the sourcing of high quality feed, for example. So this should not be at the expense of deforestation, of biodiversity. In line with that, we should take account for, or we should prevent emission swapping. So not just across greenhouse gases, but also between greenhouse gas emissions and other environmental pollutants. Optimizing the food system rather than optimizing individual production chains or sectors has also been mentioned. And finally, good science. So to solve such complex issues, we need good science. We need to understand what's going on, what the impact is, what the trade-offs are of implementing strategies and how to solve this quite difficult and complex issue. And that's it. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Karina and Simon. And I must say that was an excellent duet, really well presented, and it's a challenge to have a dual presentation, and you carried it off splendidly. So thank you. The question I would have myself is, and maybe to both of you, the role of genetics in relation to as a technological or potential solution to methane production. How far into the future are we in realizing some benefits from that approach? Does either one of you want to answer that? Karina, was that part of your PhD?
Well, a little. What I mostly did is that I considered the integral consequences of some of the breeding strategies. I didn't per se look at how much we can gain, for example, in reducing emissions.
Okay.
What I do think is that actually that has, like, for example, the increase in productivity has been a core focus, of course, of all these decades. And that has resulted in quite a low emission intensity, like I also showed in one of those graphs. And in a similar way, I think increasing productivity, but also selecting on breeds with lower methane emissions, selecting for breeds which are high feed efficiency, could result in lower emission intensity, so lower emissions per unit of product. At the same time, and that's what I also try to point out, that maybe that's not all what has to, well, we should not only focus on that, we should also consider other consequences. For example, the role of livestock in the food system is that indeed producing high amounts of good quality product, or maybe transforming waste streams or byproducts like grasses that we cannot consume as humans directly. And then that would also mean a lower productivity and maybe a higher methane emission. So then when you talk about genetics, it could also mean that we should select those animals that can value, for example, these waste streams in a better way. So not only productivity, but also other traits become important then.
And I think, Karina, your a really important point that emerged from the presentation was the importance of adopting a food system perspective. And it's something that in EURAGRI we've had some discussions on this. We had a workshop last year, or sorry, earlier in the year on this theme. Of course, it was the subject of the food summit, FAO food summit recently. And I think it's something we need to return to, because I think it raises really important questions for our approach to research, because the focus has been very much on a single sector value chain. And I think both your presentation brought out the complexity of the issue. And you mentioned also all of the dimensions associated with livestock production, including, for example, the production of ammonia gases, and the different systems. We have intensive systems in Europe versus in housing systems in Europe versus in a country like Ireland, it's pasture-based systems and so on. Sylvia, I believe you have one or two questions. Do you want to take up those, please?
There are 3 questions still for each presentation.
Maybe we'll take one. We'll take one on the presentation, and then we'll go to a general discussion.
Okay.
If that's okay.
There is still one for Simon and Corina. Also, what are the most severe detrimental trade-offs of reducing number of livestock in Europe?
Simon, do you want to take that, please?
So what are the most detrimental consequences of reducing the number of livestock in Europe? Well, the first thing that pops up with me is it will be farmers, because the way farmers are, say, because of the present economic situation, forced to farm is with many animals and high land intensity. So if you're forced to reduce the number of animals, there will definitely be less income to farmers. If it would mean that there becomes scarcity on the market for milk or meat and the prices go up, I mean, this may compensate a little bit, but then in the second situation is that consumers worldwide will have to pay more for meat and milk. So I think it's more mostly in the economic domain that there will be negative consequences. And I mean, if you talk about reducing animal numbers, it's not going back to 0 or something like that, but there's still livestock around for all other functions of livestock, like say their role in biodiversity and in culture, etc.
That needs to be remained.
Okay. Karina, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I only added that these values need to be remained, obviously. Yeah.
Okay. No, thank you. And in Ireland, as you can imagine, this is a particularly difficult question at the moment, because our dairy livestock numbers are increasing quite significantly since the removal of the dairy quota.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely essential to the improvement in livelihoods. And the balance between technological solutions, reducing intensity, versus reducing numbers is a very difficult trade-off. Now, again, I remind you, we're moving now on to a general discussion on the 3 papers, and indeed any questions that you have on the 3 papers, or indeed related issues that you're interested in, please do use the Q&A function. So,
yes, Jerry,
Sylvia,
if I may, there is a very interesting question, which I think that it was originally based on the presentation of Davy, but I think it's valuable for all presentation, and it's linked to the common agricultural policy. And the question is, farmers are a key factor. I think it's valid for all presentations. And if the national agricultural policy, or in case of non-EU countries, the national policy, is really considering farmers' environmental role. So it's recognizing the key role of farmers into this process. So maybe that's something that each panelist can answer also.
Okay. Thank you, Sylvia. Yeah, that's a very easy question. Davy, the common agricultural policy, clearly, and countries are well advanced at this stage across Europe and the European Union in preparing their strategic plans, not of course in the UK, but in the rest of Europe, the common agricultural policy has been looked at as a vehicle. But I guess in general policy terms, Davy, if you would have a view on what are the key strategies that you think are the key pathways that policy should be working towards in relation to the challenges of climate change, in your opinion?
With regard to that even broader question, or even more complex question, Jerry, then the key strategies are and need to be, as I said, that farmers have a key role to play, but farmers will need help, encouragement to actually change aspects of their systems and aspects of their practices. That help and change can come about through incentives, but it can also come about through increased regulation. Those are tools in the box that every country has. I like to make the observation, as someone who's been banging my head off the common agricultural policy wall from an environmental perspective for 30 years, that we don't have a common agricultural policy anymore. We have, or well, you have in Europe, in the EU, you have a common agricultural policy that sets a general framework, but there's still a lot of flexibility, and there has been for a number of years, for individual member states to choose how to actually implement that. And individual member states need to choose how best to implement it for their farming and the farming systems within their borders, because those do differ markedly from one EU member state to another. Within the UK, who's no longer part of the EU, the original question about our national governments really recognising farmers' role in terms of environmental management, then yes. If you look at what is happening in England are just about to go into their first year where they are moving away from the 2-pillar type approach, the approach for for support, what historically used to be production, and support for environmental management over the course of the next 4 years. What you would still recognise within the EU as your basic payment, that is going to be reduced for the vast majority of farmers in England year on year, and be replaced by an environmental land management scheme. And that environmental land management scheme will ultimately be the only public support going into agriculture within England. Here in Scotland, we're taking a different approach for now. Again, the 4 devolved areas of the UK are developing different elements of future agricultural policy at the minute. That still has to be sense checked at a wider UK level in terms of things going forward. But here in Scotland, while there's an acceptance at government level that farming is important, farming produces a wide variety of benefits that direct support to farmers is essential. There's also an undertaking that over the next 3 years, there will be a lot more environmental conditions put on that in that basic payment, that direct support. In the next 3 years, we're going to see 50% of that basic payment being subject to environmental conditions. And those are environmental conditions that are primarily focused in its first instance on achieving climate change mitigation measures. But I and others are also pushing for those environmental conditions to include biodiversity mitigation measures as well. I'll leave it at that for now, Jerry. I'm conscious you want to bring others into the discussion.
No, thank you. And I think one, I guess, benefit of the UK decision is that at least we have some diversity, more diversity, I think, as far as the policy mix is concerned. Simon, do you wish to comment on the role of the Common Agricultural Policy in addressing some of the issues that you and Karina raised in your paper, as far as Europe in particular is concerned, or the European Union?
Yeah, well, when it comes onto, say, environmental issues, there, say, as far we were just discussing. I mean, if it's EU policy that facilitates or encourages farmers to do, there's a lot of regulation, of course. That's part. But like, say, schemes in order to to pay farmers for ecosystem services, we do have them for biodiversity. So really, from out of policy, we did not recognize so much. Of course, dairy companies are paying their farmers a premium if they are involved in environmental schemes or things, or even in a quite holistic thing, taking care of welfare of biodiversity and environment at the same time. So yeah, that's how I see it. And within the CAP, this is all facilitated. Okay,
and I guess Hannah-Marie, just one dimension that I think is relevant to this discussion, this particular issue that you might wish to comment on, that is the whole importance of the carbon price. And that can be influenced, obviously, by measures such as taxation and so forth, apart altogether from the potential of carbon markets, which, as an economist, we would like to, certainly as an economist, I'd like to see setting the price. Do you have a view on that, on the importance of carbon prices providing a signal, for example, to farmers?
Yeah, I'm an environmental economist, so I'm all about carbon pricing. And one of the things, at least there's a big discussion also in Finland on agricultural land, because there isn't a direct carbon price for that. You have the carbon price for the EU emissions trading scheme, but you don't actually have carbon prices for activities outside the scheme. We have carbon taxes as well, but they're mostly for fuels and so forth. So the carbon price for rewarding mitigation in the land use sector, there isn't a reward system at the moment. So the carbon price signal is not reaching to that sector at the moment. And one of the reasons is that it's less easy to measure. And when you don't measure, it's harder to reward. And so that's something that to extend the carbon price and reward mitigation in the sectors that are not in the EU emissions trading scheme, so the land use and agriculture sector, science is needed to really quantify reliably the amounts and also the permanence of it, and just avoiding this emission swapping. So doing it at the right system level, just as we heard earlier. And there is actually at the EU level, the carbon removal certification mechanism under work, which should come as a proposal next year. And that is about the methodologies for quantifying the mitigation outcomes in removals, including in the agricultural sector, and including nature-based and also technological removals. And that is an area that, because they haven't had the science of the methodologies, then you can't really put the carbon price signals in the same way. So you really need the metrics to match them with the incentives. And it doesn't mean that it has to be only for the carbon markets. You could also have them as a basis for subsidies. So the same certification mechanism for the results, you can have different ways of rewarding the results, market-based or non-market-based. But that is such an important thing, that get the science right and the metrics right, and then you can start to incentivize. And there is a big gap there. But also, interestingly, the voluntary markets are developing methodologies, which could be interesting to look at. Some areas in the US and Canada have already calculated some methodologies. So this is an area where I expect to be a lot more work, because the carbon markets are always focusing on the next hard area to quantify. And I would say this is one of those areas. So research very much needed. So thank you for all the work you're doing on this.
No, and thank you, Hannah Marie. And I think that's, again, for our members in EURAGRI, that's, I think, a lesson that all organizations involved in research and innovation in the sector will need to reflect on very deeply. Of course, Davy mentioned, and it's relevant to Ireland as well, not to you in the Nordic countries. You have lots of forestry and you realize the potential of forestry. Forestry is one of the areas internationally where the carbon value is easier to measure than in soils, for example. We have a huge problem in Ireland and in Scotland, I think, as well, in that afforestation levels are declining. And yet at the same time, we're all quite conscious that there is a significant carbon value attached to this resource. And yet somehow or other that isn't being signaled to the owners of forestry in countries like Ireland and Scotland and so on. Sylvia, do you have a question there that you want to ask?
Well, I think we should almost close, but maybe a last one related to circularity.
Oh yes, I see that.
Yes, the question was, how important do you think circularity and livestock is in a European context? But I think also we can deal with this question as circularity as such. So
I think that's a really good.
Yeah, and then I think we should close. Maybe there are still other questions, but panelists can also type answers in the meantime.
Okay, maybe what I'll do with that question, maybe I'll pop it to you, Simon. Again, this is one of the areas like food system that has been discussed a lot without sufficient precision. I suppose it's the nature of a concept like this. It takes a while for us to get to grips with it. But where do you see the principle of circularity being applied to livestock systems, Simon, in your view?
Yeah, that's a nice question. Where do I see it applied? I think I see it applied a lot in the tropics, where there is already a lot of circularity in the farming systems and in the whole chain. I mean, the use of crop residues, agricultural industry byproducts are being used to the maximal extent in livestock nutrition. Also, there's a lot of land which is not utilizable for crop production. So there is often grass, drylands, etc. So their cattle is grazing. So there's relatively limited competition between human food production and animal feed production. So I see it being applied. But there is a big pressure on livestock in the tropics to intensify, because there's so many more people to be fed also by livestock products. So actually, it's turning away from circularity in the tropics. In the West, like in the Netherlands, it's part of the official policy to make agriculture more more circular. And so it's being applied at small scale. It has implications. Because it implies if say you feed your livestock with waste products only, your productivity will go down. It means more methane emissions and other greenhouse gases, of course, unless you reduce your herd size. And I mean, then you can get a sustainable food system, but it immediately implies that there will be less consumption of animal sourced food in the whole food system. So circularity, it's easy said. There are many good things of it. I mean, you have less waste, and also you do you make better use of nitrogen and phosphorus, for example. There's less pollution. There's even less of those nutrients circling. So that's all good, but it has an implication on eventual consumption of animal source food.
Thank you, Simon. And as Sylvia has reminded me there, we need to conclude at this stage. Just on my own view on the topic of circularity is that I think we can understand, most people can see the role of recycling and that aspect, but the other principle which I think is really important and more challenging is the cascading ideas, the idea of optimizing the value of the raw material. And I see in the Nordic countries, for example, to look at what they are doing in the forestry area is very interesting in that respect. And I think that's a challenge for research to see how we can introduce that dimension of circularity into our research. Okay, look, I want to first of all, on behalf of EURAGRI, thank Davy McCracken, Hannah Maria Honan, and Simon Oosting and Karina Middelar for their presentations. We really appreciate you taking the time. And I know, having viewed the presentations already that you gave at COP, you have actually done a lot of work in the meantime. So we really appreciate that and how you adapted the presentations for our audience. I want to thank all of those of you that tune in, and we had a large number of people tuning in, and of course for your questions. I want to thank my former colleague John Leamy of Teagasc in Ireland, who managed all of the logistics for today's webinar. And John, we really appreciate that. I want to thank Sylvia for moderating the online questions. And I do, on a personal level, I want to give a special message for our General Secretary, Bettina Hyman, that we're thinking of you at this particularly sad time. So thanks, Jürgen, and goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.